Ninja Kiwi has confirmed two things. The first is that the Wizard Monkey is the next tower that is going to get a Paragon. With the recent teases for the new tower and Dreadbloon, the Wizard Monkey Paragon is probably the next thing to be teased. But before we get any such info, I want to say everything I can about its potential and see how close I can get to predicting the real deal. The second thing confirmed by Ninja Kiwi is that Paragons are not meant to be seen as 5x5 towers. Ever since the Master Builder, they have tried to make Paragons into something more than just a tower that you build and then watch deal high damage. Even though I had my share of criticisms of the Engineer Paragon, I do like the idea of giving you something more to do with your Paragons. Things like blowing up the Master Builder's Mega Sentries, microwaving the Goliath Doomship, or aiming and timing its bombing run. These all give you something to do during the boss phase of an event, and I think that's a good thing. With the Wizard Paragon on its way, I want to discuss my ideas for how Ninja Kiwi can successfully meet their vision for the Paragon, as well as include the necessary representation that I talked about in my critique for the Master Builder. To reiterate those points, I think that a Paragon should represent the most iconic aspects of the tower it comes from, and should do so in significant ways. For example, the Engineer Paragon should have included the Balloon Trap because of how iconic that upgrade is. It also should have given you the Overclock ability, because the passive Ultra Boost to itself is not significant enough to be a good representation of that upgrade. So how can the Wizard Paragon properly represent the most important upgrades of the Wizard Monkey and be an interesting tower on its own? I have many ideas. First of all, what do we name this Paragon? Unfortunately, Archmage is already taken, even though that would have been the best name for the ultimate wizard. Of course, we can always call it the Grand Wizard. I'm sure nobody would find that offensive in any way. But there are even better names to pick. Introducing the Grand Magus. Unravel the mysteries of the arcane arts and see for yourself why they are kept secret. According to my calculations, the Wizard Paragon will cost 500,000 cash. This is because if you take the cost of other Paragons and divide them by the total cost of the 3 upgrade paths combined, you always get a multiple of 0.5 between 3 and 5.5 rounded. So in order to get the cost of a Paragon, you take the total cost of the tower's upgrades combined, multiply it by any multiple of 0.5, and you'll get the cost of the Paragon. I plugged in 3.5 and got around 500,000, which seems like a nice clean number. It's also a good middle ground between the Dart and Boomerang Paragons and all of the other Paragons. Now, let's finally start talking about gameplay. First, what is the bare minimum that this tower needs for it to properly represent the Wizard Monkey? Second, what can it do with its playstyle to be unique amongst the other Paragons? It should go without saying that all of its attacks should deal normal damage. Even though it's based on the Wizard Tower, I think it would be so disappointing if the Paragon got blocked by purples. The Grand Magus should be able to pop every balloon with every one of its attacks. Now, starting with the top path, it should also go without saying that its projectiles should inherit the properties of guided magic. The Grand Magus should be able to see over obstacles with all attacks, and have the seeking property on its main attack. Speaking of the main attack, that's where the rest of the top path comes into play. This path can just be summarized as more DPS, but that goes without saying for all Paragons. All Paragons deal high damage to bosses, all Paragons attack quickly, and they all have around 70 range. This is where I think the Wizard can stand out, even if it's only in a small way for now. I envision its primary attack being stronger, faster, and having more range than the other Paragons so far. This is because Arcane Spike specializes in attack speed and bonus Moab damage. Sure, a couple of other upgrades like Deconstruction also add bonus Moab damage, but none of them were a huge difference maker in the way that Arcane Spike is supposed to be. I think that, for this reason, the Grand Magus deserves to have an especially strong base attack with very high range that has low pierce. In other words, it completely focuses on boss DPS, but struggles against any extra spawns. If that sounds bad, fear not, because that's only the attack from the top path. The Wizard has 2 more paths to draw inspiration from, and the middle path might be the most interesting. The Tier 4 summons a Phoenix, and I think that is too iconic to not include in the Paragon 2. Since the 5th tier makes the ability permanent, and has an ability to summon a second, stronger Phoenix, I think the Grand Magus should follow the same trend. It should have a permanent version of the Wizard Lord Phoenix's ability. But then, what should the Paragon's ability be? That's assuming it has one at all. Personally, I'm a fan of giving abilities to as few Paragons as possible. That way, when a Paragon actually has an ability, it's really something special. With the direction that Ninja Kiwi is taking Paragons though, I have a suspicion that almost every Paragon will have an ability. But discussing ability ideas would be stepping into speculative territory when I want to focus on the bare minimums for now. I think that a global range Phoenix is the only mandatory part of the Paragon, but if it had additional attacks like Wall of Fire and Dragon's Breath, I definitely wouldn't complain. Just like the Ascended Shadow has a Flash Bomb attack that gets covered up and overshadowed by all of its other projectiles, I imagine that things like a Fireball would be secondary to more outstanding attacks. An example of a more outstanding attack in my opinion is Wall of Fire. This would basically be the solution to all Moabs and smaller balloons passing through it, so that the Paragon can be put on strong. Dragon's Breath would also be a bit more iconic, good enough to include, to give it some bonus damage when its target is at closer range. If it had all of these attacks at once, that would be pretty cool, but not the bare minimum. The thing is though, the tier 5s of the top and middle path both have a plethora of attacks at their disposal. Archmage gets Dragon's Breath already, and Shimmer. Wizardlord Phoenix keeps the Fireball, Wall of Fire, Dragon's Breath, and the Phoenix. So it seems pretty clear that the Paragon should have a lot of attacks too. But I have an idea that might change what the best implementation would be. However, I'm going to save that for after I discuss the bottom path implementation. The most important thing to include from the bottom path is obviously the ability to spawn zombie balloons. It's only natural that the graveyard mechanic should be expanded upon, with a larger maximum graveyard and more balloon types to spawn. The Prince of Darkness would spawn stronger balloons like zombie Moabs and BFBs when the graveyard was more full, and it dealt more damage with all attacks based on how full it is. So having a larger capacity that allows the Grand Magus to scale its damage even further and spawn even stronger balloons is going to be one of the most fun mechanical options for a Wizard Paragon in my opinion. It will be so satisfying to place it in an optimal spot to maximize the graveyard and then benefit from higher damage on all of its attacks. Since this will also be harder to maintain though, it should also gain improved balloon spawns. Specifically, I wanted to spawn zombie ZOMGs that are far stronger than zombie BFBs. Just to be clear, the zombie Moabs and BFBs should be stronger than the Prince of Darkness versions. They should scale up in damage with the Paragon's degree of course. But the point is, the ZOMG would be insanely strong even relative to the Grand Magus' other balloon spawns. They would pose a huge cost to the graveyard every time they spawn. Maintaining that would be quite difficult, so that it's actually rewarding to keep it high and therefore deal more damage with all of the Paragon's attacks. Shimmer probably ought to be kept too, but not at the cost of giving the Paragon default camo detection. It should still be able to see and pop every balloon type no matter what. The Shimmer would only be there for non-Paragon towers. And speaking of non-Paragon towers, Necromancers can get a buff from Prince of Darkness. If the Grand Magus provided a further buff, I wouldn't complain about that at all. But I'm not sure who's going to be using those towers once they already have a Paragon down. Finally, since both the top and bottom path add a ton of range to the tower, the Grand Magus should have the highest range of all Paragons thus far. We desperately need a Paragon that doesn't get stunned by Vortex at tier 5, and the Wizard is the perfect opportunity to finally introduce that. The Apex Plasma Master has 85 range. If the Grand Magus had the same or even higher range, I would be very pleased. That's it for my requirements for the Grand Magus. It needs a fast, high damage base attack, high range, the ability to see over obstacles, a permanent Phoenix, Shimmer, and an expanded graveyard of ZOMGs. It would be nice to have other attacks and traits too. However, there's something important to keep in mind about the synergy of this tower's attacks. The graveyard rewards you for placing the tower in range of where balloons are popped. It also rewards you for placing the tower in a spot where it can summon right on top of the balloons. That way, it doesn't spawn them out of the way on another part of the track, or on another track entirely, which would get in the way of maintaining its graveyard too. The most optimal spot would almost certainly be at the entrance, since Paragons would eradicate everything in sight. Meanwhile though, the Phoenix has global range. It could pop balloons anywhere on the map, including out of reach of the graveyard. This is what gave birth to my idea of a mode switching ability. Just like the ability to instantly change hands on the Boomerang, the Grand Magus should have the ability to switch attack modes as well. Rather than an ability, it would be instant so that you can always micro this Paragon between modes to maximize its efficiency. I believe that Ninja Kiwi wants each player to get one Paragon each and have a role to fulfill by microing that Paragon to the best of their ability against the boss. This ability for the Grand Magus would fulfill that need perfectly, but I need to explain what exactly these two modes are first. Since the middle and bottom path are contradictory to each other, these are the two modes that the Paragon should be able to switch between. The high single target damage of the top path should always be active regardless of modes. Starting with the bottom path, the graveyard is going to have a much larger capacity. Maybe it can even scale with the Paragon degree, but with that higher capacity comes more expensive bloon spawns. What if, after reaching a certain capacity, the zombie bloons get replaced with zombie ceramics? These are obviously much stronger and do more damage, but they cost far more for the graveyard. They might even be less efficient in terms of damage per graveyard point, but they do more damage per second, and that's what's most important in a ranked boss event. Likewise, ZOMGs would drain a huge chunk from the Paragon's graveyard, forcing it to have thousands of RBE popped in its range per second to maintain. It would do the most damage out of the two modes as long as it can be maintained, but in practice, it most likely won't be possible. The Grand Magus is going to do a huge amount of burst damage, which then peters out until the graveyard gets some breathing room to fill back up. That just won't be good enough for optimal boss gameplay. So, when the graveyard has too much strain on it, players can switch to the Fire mode. The permanent Wizard Lord Phoenix is spawned, blasting fireballs in a circular flight path. Then, all of the other fire attacks are available to the Grand Magus as well. This does more damage than a low capacity graveyard, but less than a high capacity graveyard. It's up to the player to keep an eye on the graveyard to know when to switch between modes. That's why I believe the graveyard should be able to be restored while in the other mode, so that you have an incentive to go back and forth regularly. But DPS should not be the only deciding factor. Necrobloons can get pierce capped if enough junk is in front of the tower. The Fire mode can also be used to clear the map more easily. This might seem like it only applies to Bloon areas, but that's not necessarily true. The global range of the Phoenix can also be useful against Lich's chained Moabs on multi-lane maps. Global range is also useful against Vortex when avoiding getting stunned. So the Fire mode has a utility against all three bosses. And that sums up my ideas for the Wizard Paragon. There's no way that it's still open to suggestions at this point in time. These are just some ideas I wanted to share because I've had them in my mind for a long time. I think the idea of switching modes is a great concept worth exploring, and the Grand Magus was my way of doing that. There might be even better towers to use that concept on. For now though, I want to direct my attention to ideas for future Paragons. Currently, the tower I have in my crosshairs is the Sniper. I'm really excited to share some ideas on that tower, and I hope that lots of other people are too.